If we look at a game like Limbo, for example, Limbo was one giant level, right? It doesn't feel like it's too long though. So why is that? It's because of the storytelling, okay? Because the storytelling is completely told within the gameplay. At no time does the player feel like they're not playing a story. They always feel like they're at some part in the story. Hi there, welcome to Dev Brew. This is where indie developers send their games and I do my best to give feedback on their game design. That's starting to sound like an intro, like a YouTube intro. This is OmegaBot by Simon Carney. Thank you so much for submitting this game. This was a great game. The game link is in the description if you would like to play it. Costs about $10 on Steam. I highly recommend it. This is a great game. So getting right into it, I love this game. Whenever I'm sent games to analyze, I look at the game as it's a scientific thing to understand and kind of, pick apart and try to figure out. But this game is so expressive in its maneuverability and its playability and its game mechanics. Everything that the player can do feels really free. It feels very that reminds me of Mega Man, which I know was one of the inspirations for this, and specifically the bosses I really liked, which is really interesting because I hate bosses. In fact, one of the games that I had covered on Dev Brew in the past, it was called Curse of Zix. Wow, I can't believe I remembered that. Curse of Zix was a game that it was a pretty ambitious, really ambitious, like Metroidvania kind of platformer. It had some bosses that I absolutely loved, and I think what I love so much about that game's bosses and this game's bosses, I like the idea that the player can just express themselves by attacking the boss whenever they want, as opposed to having to wait for certain times to attack a boss. That's a whole thing I have a whole thing against bosses, which I've mentioned before, and I will talk about it in a future episode, I promise, but not now. When you submit a game to me, there's a little questionnaire that you got to fill out, and one of the questions is, what are you least proud of in your design? One of them is also, what are you most proud of, but also, what are you least proud of? The developer of this game, Simon, you said you were least proud of not having enough variety in your levels or mechanics or enemies or making the levels too long. It's just kind of a laundry list of things that you put in there. I imagine you just mean that all of those things are things that you're not sure about, that maybe they could be improved upon. One thing is I found that the levels were not at all lacking in variety. I thought the levels had fantastic variety. There's so much variety in the way that you use the mechanics. I really like the idea of using the shooting also for just getting around, for platforming. The mechanics are really good. I like the different kinds of breakable walls that you have. The idea is that you have different enemies that have different types of styles of attacking. Some characters have shields that you have to attack them from behind or when they raise their shield. Some characters have hats that you can't attack from above, but rather from side to side. I think that's really cool. There's a lot of really, really fun stuff in this game. One of the things that caught me off guard was you said you were worried that the levels might be too long. I don't really think about levels being too long many times in platformers because it feels like it's just a level that I'm playing. I might as well just go throughout the level. They're just a bunch of different challenges, right? I should just be able to get through the whole thing and not think about the length at all. But the levels too long thing got me thinking. I had to think hard about it, but I was thinking, yeah, actually the first level does feel too long. But why is that? You mentioned that you got a lot of feedback on the first level already and that you'd wanted deeper thoughts on the other levels, the ones afterwards. And I'm here to tell you that, sorry, I'm going to be talking about the first level. And I know that you probably want, more coverage on the other levels, but this is important. There's a reason for this. Talking about the other levels really quickly, those other levels are really, really well done. They're all really well done, but specifically the later ones, the ones after you begin the story and everything starts to set in, they all have really good themes about them. They all have progressive challenges. When it comes down to the base of why all those levels feel really good, I think it has to do with the idea of progressing and what the player is actually trying to achieve. The first level in this game doesn't have a whole big sense of progression. And I think that's the reason why it feels too long, is because it doesn't feel like there's a purpose to the level other than being able to try to pick up on the mechanics and trying to learn what the game is all about and then go on with your story afterwards. But the first act of the story kind of feels like a surprise almost, and I don't think it should feel that way. I feel like it should be introduced to you as you're playing the game. What's weird about that is when I first played this game, when I first played this first level, I thought it was fun. It was a fun game. And what popped in my mind were the words, fun little platformer. And I saw that a bunch actually on your Steam reviews. They were all positive reviews, and they said, fun little platformer, fun gem, something like that. I think there's a reason why we use those words, why we use the words fun little platformer or hidden gem or whatever. And I think it's because if I were to play just the first section up until, say, like 3/4 into it, I just figured I was going to stop playing it and go away, I wouldn't ever feel like I had left something on the table. I wouldn't feel like the game was incomplete. I would have felt like, okay, well, that's a fun game. I'll come back to it at some other time or whatever. Whereas if you look at the game that you were inspired by, Mega Man or Cave Story, if you were to leave the game, say, 2 minutes in when you played it, you would understand exactly where you left off, because they set certain expectations when you play the game. In Mega Man, you have to select a boss, right, in order to progress and beat him. And in Cave Story, it's all about a narrative that's unfolding, and at any point in the game, you know exactly where you are in that narrative. And so I want to talk about progression, and I want to talk about why the first level doesn't really feel like there's much progression happening. Just before we get into that, I wanted to talk about the mechanics really quickly. The mechanics are great. They're really, really fun. But one bug I just wanted to point out was the joystick. So I read your community page in Steam, and I saw that that the gamepad was just integrated, so you just put in the controls, I think recently, can't remember exactly. And so what was nice about that is I actually play all these games with an Xbox One controller, so that was really cool that I just happened to have the exact controller that you programmed for it. So that was great, and it felt really good to play this game with that controller. But it made sense that you were making this for a keyboard first, or at least for digital input first, because using analog sticks for this game doesn't really work too well. It does work. It works much better than it has for other games that don't use joysticks. Joysticks have a float value, and I know you know what that is since you're made an entire game, but the float value between 0 and 1 can be any kind of decimal number between there. And what happens with that is that the movement of the robot in this game directly correlates, I think, 1-to-1 with that number, with the float number that's happening. So if I were to flick the stick one way, then the stick bounces back a little bit on the opposite way, which causes the robot to turn that way. So if I want to go right, for example, and I go right and then let go of the stick really quickly, then the robot will suddenly turn around and I'll be facing left. And you can see right here, this is what's happening. If I flick the stick one way or the other, then the robot will continue that way and then quickly face the other way. And what's weird about that is that if you're maneuvering really quickly, it can get really aggravating when you're trying to quickly move in one direction, but the robot keeps facing the wrong direction. So I wanted to talk about progression. So looking at the progression of Mega Man, like I said, you select a boss first, and then you go and you play the level until you get to that boss. And in Cave Story, you always know where you are in the narrative. In your game, you kind of have that same kind of narrative progression happening. You have a whole cinematic that plays when you first begin the game. And this opening cinematic sets context for the game. And what I imagine is going to happen, since I'm playing an indie game, a game that from a studio that I've never heard before. When I play this game and the cinematic plays, I'm imagining, okay, so the cinematic is setting up context, and then I play the game, and there's no direct connection between what I'm playing right here and what the cinematic just showed me. Kind of like in Curse of Zix, actually. In Curse of Zix, it was the same way, where the cinematic will tell the story, set up the context, and then let the player, do the stuff. And it's neat for kind of like a setting place where you're just like, okay, this is what you got to do, go ahead. And it feels fine. It feels tropey almost. It feels just kind of like it's a thing that works, so that's why it's there. However, your game, OmegaBot, is so much more than that. It's way more than just here's a little story, there you go. Because when you get into the game and you start playing it, after you get beyond the first level, then you start interacting with characters, and you have a hub world that comes back with more characters that you save, throughout this whole thing. Every boss isn't just a boss, but it's a boss that's somehow connected within the plot. And then the plot progresses, and it even has a twist at the end, which I thought was really interesting, because whenever you're playing these levels, they're thematically connected to whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. So All that being said, there's so much more in this game than just an opening cinematic. So what's wrong with the opening cinematic? Well, nothing really, but it's more of the connection between that opening cinematic and the first level. As I said, this game feels much bigger than just a contextualized platformer. It feels like a plot that's integrated into a platformer, which I think is the best kind. However, I don't really see that in the first level. And I think that's the issue. That's what feels like there's maybe not enough variety, maybe that the level's too long, or maybe that there's not enough enemies. When I think about these problems, it feels as if these are the problems that are existing, but I don't think there is. I think the underlying issue is that there's no overall purpose in the first level. I don't think there's a connected tissue between the first level and the overall plot. And I know there's probably a reason for this, and I think the reason is that it's a comfortable atmosphere for the player to, kind of get their bearings and try to understand the world before they, take on this entire game. And it's nice to have that in the very beginning, but it does feel like it goes on a little too long. And I think there's ways to connect that first level with the rest of the story without intimidating the player. And I think all it takes is just a little bit of environmental storytelling, or maybe adding challenges that have to do with a thematic connection between who you are and what you're trying to do. Because at the end of this level, like I said, it feels like it's a surprise. It feels like, oh, surprise, you're in a plot and this is a story that's happening. And it would be really interesting if that's what you're trying to go for, if you're trying to surprise the player. But it doesn't feel like a good surprise. It feels like a surprise like, oh, I should have been paying attention and I wasn't. If you look at something like this in Sonic 3 is a game that has a narrative in it. When you're playing the game, there's moments that the boss will come in and just kind of like tease you for a second. In the first level, there's that fire-looking boss that comes in and kind of just sets the entire level on fire, then f***s off. Later on, there's that drill enemy that pops up every now and then and will cause earthquakes and whatnot. It's like that kind of stuff is storytelling. That's how you get the player to understand what it is that they're trying to do. When this boss comes in, it's an immediate threat, and the player feels like, okay, I have to destroy that thing. So then when it goes away, then you're like, oh, I have to go pursue that. Even in the beginning of Sonic 3, Knuckles attacks Sonic, collects his emeralds, and then goes off. And now it's up to Sonic. You have to go find him, go get Knuckles, right? And so when there's other threats that come along, you understand that there's a progression happening. You understand that there's a theme here. And instead of an opening cinematic, they're just peppered in throughout the gameplay. And I feel like that's the best way to connect the player with your narrative, is through the gameplay itself. I'm not totally against cinematics, but I don't think they have a connection with the gameplay. I think they provide context, but if we look at a game like Limbo, for example, Limbo was one giant level, right? It doesn't feel like it's too long, though. So why is that? It's because of the storytelling. Okay, because the storytelling is completely told within the gameplay. At no time does the player feel like they're not playing a story. They always feel like they're at some part in the story. And OmegaBot feels like it's a narrative game, but in the first level, again, it doesn't really feel like it's connected to the gameplay. A sense of progression can come across in many different forms, right? I feel like narrative would fit your game the best, but there's other types of progression. For example, Super Mario Odyssey uses collectibles. They also kind of use narrative very lightly, but most Mario games are like that, where they have some sort of collectible that you understand, oh, I need to get 6 stars in this area, then I can go. Or I need to get 10 moons, or at least 5 moons in this area, then I can go. Like, you understand exactly what you have to do. There's an overall goal there. And then there's a game like Katana Zero. Katana Zero is all about one big narrative, and every single gameplay part that you have is set up with context. And you actually have a little bit of this in your game, where you have, I want to call him Mark Twain, or the KFC looking dude. This character, he sets up a little bit of context for you before you head out into the level. And it's cool because it takes place within the gameplay. It kind of feels a little bit more like Celeste to me, where there's a narrative, a little bit of narrative happening, and then you have a bunch of gameplay in front of you that's now contextualized. And I feel like that works really well when the character is talking to you in the game world itself. But when it's in an opening cinematic, it doesn't really work for the intro level, especially if the intro level is going to take that long. Because again, it feels long because I don't know if we have a goal, So that's what I have to say about the game and the narrative progression, and that's how I feel like these elements that you talked about in the beginning, that I feel like there may not be enough variety or that the levels are too long, I think they may be connected to that idea. I need to feel like I'm understanding what I'm going to do in that first level, like peppered in throughout the gameplay. I need to understand, oh, I'm headed towards something. I'm actually doing something. I would like to gush more about this game because this game has really, really good design. There's really good platform and level design in here to where you've silently tutorialized like the entire game, and it feels really, really good. So if you want more analysis of something like that, or if you're a viewer that wants to see something like that broken down, go to my Discord at gamesover.coffee. You can find a link in the community tab. If you go over there, get a hold of me and see if we can work out something where I can make another video about the breakdown of this game, because there's a lot of really good stuff here. And if not, that's totally cool too. But that's what I have to say. I'm sorry that I only talked about the first level. I know you didn't want that, but again, I think you can see where the reasoning was behind that. So thank you so much for watching Dev Brew. I'll catch you guys later.